Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Cadwell Turnbull. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
Cadwell Turnbull is the author of the debut novel, The Lesson, this beautiful book I have in my hands, just now out in paperback. He is a graduate from the North Carolina State University's Creative Writing, Masters of Fine Arts in Fiction, and also an English Master's in Linguistics. Turnbull is also a graduate of Clarion West 2016. His short fiction has appeared in The Verge, Lightspeed, Nightmare, and Asimov's science fiction. And so we are going to talk today about this fantastic book, The Lesson. So let's just start at the top. Please tell me about the book.
The Lesson is an alien first contact novel set in the US Virgin Islands. It follows three families as they adjust to life after a race of super advanced aliens called Ynaa arrive and set up shop on Water Island, which is off the coast of St. Thomas. The aliens have come with gifts, but they also have a very different culture, and so there are tensions between the local islanders and the aliens reach a culmination without spoiling too much.
Yes, without spoiling too much. And I love the way you describe that because it is both the story of three families and it has that like very relational like feeling to it. You get the sense of these characters, and it's the story of aliens and first contact. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those two elements in a minute, but you also mentioned that the book is set in the US Virgin Islands. So what was it like to write a setting that you know well alongside speculative elements, alongside like in aliens, you know, in this first contact? And how did that cause you to rethink your sense of place?
I mean, when I first started writing fiction, I did not write about home at all. I didn't read a lot of fiction that was set in the Virgin Islands or in St. Thomas, so I think I kind of internalized subconsciously that that wasn't a place that you could write about. But once I made that decision, especially when I started writing about it for the book, it just opened up a lot of like lived in experience. Like I could draw from so much more because I was writing about home. And so I wrote in the book, there's places that I would hang out with friends, you know. My high school is in the book. My middle school is probably mentioned in the book. You know, there's just so many places that I touched on. The legislature mentioned in the book, and my mom worked at the legislature when I was growing up. So I was just pulling so much from things that I had experienced. But I also, once I started working on the book, I realized that there was a lot of gaps in my own knowledge about the place. And so I read a lot of history books, I read papers, I looked at old maps, I looked at pictures, and there was all of these things that I was trying to fill in, some of the historical context that I feel like when you live in a place you take for granted, you know, like it's just like, oh, I know that place. I know what I'm talking about. But then I realized like, oh, I actually don't. And so I did a lot of research and I went back home when I was working on the final revisions for the book. I went back home to just visit all of the spots that I had written about. And that was a really great experience. I went to Hull Bay, which is like, it's a place in, that's really hard to get to. It's like, you have to go through a bunch of winding roads, but it's like a big part of the book. It's like the climax of the book. And I went out to the water, it was at night, and I like saw these things like kind of bobbing in the waves. And I didn't know what they were. They were kind of like thick, like long things. And I took my camera phone out and I flashed the water, and there was like all of these like fish eyes that just like glowed back at me. And that image was so remarkable. I ended up putting it in the book. It was one of those things that I didn't know about that. I didn't know that like you could just go at night and find fish just kind of idling next to the water. And so it was a really good experience, really cool experience to kind of know a place and also realize how many of the things about a place you didn't know.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. That's actually really interesting context. And like, there is something about writing a place that it acknowledges your gaps as much as it acknowledges like
Right.
what you know well. And I mean, how did it feel to like, you mentioned that the alien race is the Ynaa. And so how did it feel to all of a sudden like put the Ynaa on your home? Like, did that feel like, oh, I'm sorry, but I kind of need to do this for the book? Like, how did that feel?
It was really cool. I mean, so there's a scene pretty early in the book where there's an Ina in a bar, and this is a bar that like I would go when I would go back home and hang out with friends. We would go to that bar and we would hang out and we would play pool. And so it's just really interesting and odd and surreal to have like all the things that I'm used to, and then an alien inside there. And so, it was just, there was a lot of opportunities like that where I could just kind of have fun, where I could be like, oh, what if an alien was there? Or what if an alien was walking down Main Street? What would that be like? And that sort of thing.
Oh, so fun, so interesting. And the other thing that like is really great about the lesson is that you take on some pretty big themes and some pretty big issues like race, like colonialism, like power, both physical power and political power. What drew you to these themes and how did you play with weaving them throughout the story?
Right. So the dream that inspired the book was set in a small town. It was pretty much the same concept. There was like aliens, they were integrated into the town, and when they got upset, they would respond with like, disproportionate wrath. They would get really, violent in response to, little slights, perceived threats. I made the decision pretty early on that I wanted to set it in the Virgin Islands. And so once I made that decision, it became clear that I had to talk about or explore the Virgin Islands context. Like people in that place would bring certain things to that experience that someone from, let's say, a small town in the Midwest wouldn't. And one of those big things was colonialism. Like the Virgin Islands and St. Thomas in particular is predominantly Black, and a lot of those people are descendants of slaves. My family's a descendants of slaves. So I wanted to talk about that. I felt like if aliens, these super advanced aliens, were to show up in the Virgin Islands and they were to have the kind of power that they have, people from the Virgin Islands would connect that to prior experiences of being, colonized or being occupied, or, other superpowers influencing the place. And it would be inevitable that that would be a theme that would be important to them. And so it became important to me to write about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for exploring those issues. I find that fiction oftentimes kind of gives us a great way in. Sometimes, kind of facing things head on, it's sometimes too much. So sometimes, having like the Ina as a way to sort of like see colonialism maybe in a little bit
Mm-hmm.
different way that makes it kind of reverberate a little bit more, or to see kind of these questions of race. Like that's super, super interesting. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how that would absolutely be at play with the characters in the novel and what they would be bringing to the Inaa's presence there. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, and one of the things also that's happening in this moment is also the movement for Black lives. So, what are some of the lessons as you played with those in the book that also seem to reverberate alongside the Black Lives Movement?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that one of the things, so, oh man, I want to talk about this without talking about like any big spoilers, but there is an event that happens in the book that is really like impacting for the community. Someone has an altercation with the Ina, and it leads to a tragedy. And there's there's a perspective character in the book that is really close to that tragedy and is really frustrated by the fact that there's nothing that the people of the Virgin Islands can do. They can't do anything about the fact that the Ina are committing these atrocities because they have immunity. They're not from Earth. And so that frustration, I think, is something that I wanted to write about and do justice by. I wanted to make sure that it was written about in a way that was very empathetic, that someone that is a legitimate response to the, being oppressed, being marginalized, being brutalized by a force that is in some ways bigger and stronger than you. And I think that in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, or talking about things like police brutality, I think it's important to remember that people have a lot of different responses to being brutalized, and sometimes those responses are anger, and that anger is legitimate, because these are things that shouldn't be happening. It's the assumption that people should have a reasonable reaction to something that's unreasonable seems to be an extra injustice. It's something that is it's not just frustrating, but it's also a extra bit of humiliation to have to notice something is very wrong, and then have to argue and beg for the powers that be, the dominant culture, to recognize that there's something wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, and for kind of just sort of sitting with that question, because I think it's a really important question, and it is certainly present in the news and present in our lives, and absolutely present in the book. And as we've talked about, the book weaves together both the literary, the story of these families, but also the speculative, the stories of the Ynaa and their presence there, and their immunity, as you mentioned. And so, kind of thinking about some of the bigger context, thinking about Black Lives Matter, but also thinking about what each genre, literary work, speculative work, science fiction, what is it about all of that drew you to weave that all together? Were there elements of literary you wanted to make sure that worked well with elements of science fiction? Yeah, talk to me more about weaving those two things together.
I started the book when I was in my MFA, and I was lucky to have an MFA experience where both of those things were happening at the same time. So I had a professor that wrote speculative fiction on the literary side, and then I also had professors that wrote literary fiction. And so because I was in that environment and I was reading all sorts of stuff, I was reading science fiction, which I love, but I was also reading a lot of literary work. I was learning from both, and I was bringing the things that I was learning into the same room with each other. And so I was able to benefit from having that dual experience. And so when I was working on the book, it just seemed really natural, especially because I was in a program where there was a lot of literary writers. It wasn't a lot of spec writers. It just seemed natural to kind of bring in the things that some of the readers, that some of my peers would be used to, and also the things that I love, like aliens. It was a good match.
Oh, fascinating. Well, thank you. Thank you for weaving those together. Certainly that's, something that I love to read, like myself as a reader. I'm always really drawn to literary fiction, but I'm always really drawn to, I think I grew up reading way too much Roald Dahl. There was something about Matilda being able to move things with her eyes that I've never been able to shake as an adult. So I love kind of playing with some of those speculative elements. So glad to know that
So cool.
has also been true for you. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of the Matilda movie. I think that I grew up and I probably watched, while I was growing up, I watched that maybe 50 times. It's just, and then also I used to watch a lot of space shows and space movies with my mom. My mom was a really big fan of the Star Trek movies, especially the Next Generation ones. And so we would watch them together. We would talk about them. And so it was something that was just always there, present, while simultaneously me being interested in wanting to be a writer and, learning about the literary side of things.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so fun that you and I grew up on, kind of a similar diet of some of the stories that we were consuming. That's fantastic. I also watched a lot of Star Trek: The Next Generation, so we have that in common too. And so my next question, we are having this conversation in September of 2020. We are still in the midst of COVID-19. And early on in the book, there is this really amazing quote, and I'm gonna read your words back to you if you don't mind. It says, "Life didn't prepare you for the big things. They didn't announce themselves or watch their feet, mindful of their intrusion. All big things were rude strangers." And I remember like reading that line and just like stopping and being like, oh my gosh, yes. So do you feel like, can you speak a little bit more to this sentiment and how, if it applies to the pandemic for you? And if so, like why or why not?
The the book, the paperback came out in June, and we had all of this like press stuff planned. We were gonna do, some events, pretty much in the area, and then the pandemic happened, and some of those events got canceled. Some of those things went online. We did some virtual events instead, um, and so even in that sense, it was like we had all of these big plans, and it became clear that pretty quickly that we weren't going to be able to do them. And as the pandemic went on, it also became clear just how many things a lot of people had to sacrifice. People had to sacrifice you know big life events that just they come around like once in your life. They had to sacrifice jobs. Some jobs just weren't viable because of the pandemic. Some people lost family members. Some people lost people really close to them. I had a friend from back home that inspired one of the characters in the book that passed away because of COVID. And so it's just um, yeah, it's just one of those things where you can't prepare for something like this, but it's also like a really good reminder to keep that in mind when you're going through life, that there's things that can happen that you can't prepare for. And so you have to treat the day like something that you can it's something that you can look back on without regrets. You have to keep moving forward in a way that is aware of how precious life is in the moment.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm so sorry for your loss. And yeah, and these are really hard moments. I think you're right that the thing we can do is sort of be present and be grateful and make the most of this moment that we have, because it is what we have. And yeah, and there's loss. So yeah, thank you. Because both exist together, right? So yeah. And so, kind of with this moment that we have your beautiful book. So, must readers take your moment, read the lesson. And as my last question, so this just came out in paperback this summer, but it was out in hard copy before that and came out to really fantastic reviews. It's garnered starred reviews, it's got an award nomination, and just lots and lots of praise. And so, tell me, how has it felt to have your debut in the world and to have it so well received? And how have you been able to connect with readers, recently here over Zoom or through virtual events, or before the pandemic when it came out last year?
It was surprising. I didn't. So because I've been doing like, I went to school, I did the MFA, I've been attending workshops for a long time before I published anything. I was doing this kind of like writer work, like the thing where when you get serious about writing and you want to, learn as much as you can. I I was doing that stuff, and I had like very pragmatic goals for my work because of it. Like I knew that, a lot of people, they publish their first book and people respond to it, but it's not something that's gonna, have this big response. Like you kind of have to be, you have to think about it in the long term is the thing. You have to think about, oh, okay, well, this book is a good solid start. I'll work on my next book, and then my next book, and maybe like 4 or 5 books down the line, people are going to be paying attention, that kind of thing. But then the book came out, and even before the book coming out, there was just these signs that people were really responding to it, and it was just really surprising. And I think because I had such grounded ideas about what was going to happen, I just took it all in with just excitement. I wasn't like, I didn't know what to expect. So I was like, oh wow, oh wow. It was just like having these unique experiences back to back. And in terms of like interacting with readers, pretty early on we did like trade show events and cons and that kind of thing, and it was really good to interact with readers that way. But now, every once in a while on social media, someone will just reach out to me and just be like, you don't know me, but I really enjoyed your book, you know, and that stuff is like just really exciting. And every time someone does it, I just, you know, I respond with just like immense gratitude, because it's, you know, it's someone's taking like time out of their day, time out of their year to read this book. And it's just an honor to have that, you know, be a part of that and have someone get value out of of something that I put into the world.
Oh, well, fantastic. Well, I'm so glad that those readers are finding you. And as a reader too, I think that it's mutual honor and respect and gratitude, because as a reader, I'm also so grateful for authors who take the time, spend the time with the characters, create this world that I can immerse myself into. And so it really is this like beautiful symbiosis. So know that like I am also sending lots of gratitude. Thank you. Thank you for writing the lesson.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reading it.
Oh, truly my pleasure. And thank you so very much. Cadwell Turnbull, author of the lesson. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. Yeah, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me. This was awesome.